My name is Morgan Hunlen. My pronouns are she and they. I am currently a planner with a small for-profit planning firm called the Thrivance Group. Um, but I just recently graduated from Rutgers this past May. So it's kind of, oh, yeah. So this is May. So that's kind of where I'm coming from right now. Um, this particular panel is going to be on LGBT plus people in transportation. And I know a lot of you guys may be thinking, like, what are the issues here? And part of what this panel is going to be about, this sort of going about, talking about what sort of the issues and problems that queer people face riding public transit. Trigger warnings in this panel. It's going to feature homophobia, transphobia, queer and trans violence, police brutality, and disturbing images. I'm going to try and get through these as quick as I possibly can. And before any of them come up, I will definitely let you know like when one of these things are going to happen. So yeah, that's all there is to it there. We don't have enough time for discussion. If we do, I'll come back to these. But like, as far as like, I have timed this out right now. I just don't have enough time to do introductions. I don't have to like they go out and talk to everyone, which I'd love to do. We'll see what ends up happening. This panel does go into lunch, so that means at the end of this, we'll be getting a break no matter what. If there's a bit of time for discussion, we'll try and fit it in then. So I can kind of break this presentation down into three main parts. My first part talks about sort of the culture surrounding queer people in public transit when it comes to like driving and not driving, using the bus and not using the bus, et cetera, et cetera. The second one talks about harassment and positive and negative experiences. And the last one talks about what I think is the most important issue, access to jobs and resources. At the end of my presentation, I have a little Menti poll. I would love to hear what some of your like guys' experiences and opinions are. It comes to these sort of topics, and I will talk about it when we get to there. So there is this culture surrounding queer people in transit. I think that like if you spend a lot of time in queer circles, you get the understanding, like you probably have heard one or two times the idea that like gays don't drive, right? And it's a prevailing like cultural stereotype that's been around for decades. There's a whole sorts of articles and groups and stuff that focus not only specifically on like that idea that gays can't drive, but on queer people's relationship to public transit. And there's like a lot of ways you could go about it, but I think that regardless of the ways that it started, it's something that's big and it's happening. These are just two specific Facebook groups that focus on this topic that are specifically looking at like queer people's interactions with public transit. So it's definitely like a big thing. And I think a lot of that just comes from the fact that queer culture and queer communities are oftentimes rooted in urban environments. There was a study done by Nicholas Klein of Cornell and then Michael Smart of Rutgers, who basically looked at same-sex couples and went, are they more likely to drive, take public transit, or walk, depending on where they are? And the research came back and they kind of found out that like queer same-sex couples are far more likely to take transit than drive, regardless of where they live and regardless of income. Men are a little more likely to use public transit and bike and walk, mostly because there's issues we can go into there that really aren't related to this panel, but like basically just men just feel safer walking and biking on the street than like women do. But regardless of that, even with that gender thing accounted for, the rates of transit usage and biking and walking in queer communities is very, very higher. It's much higher than straight communities. And this trend sort of carries over, regardless of whether you're living in the suburbs or in an urban area or not. And there's a lot of reasons why this sort of happens. Like I said earlier, queer communities are often rooted in urban environments, but also queer people also don't have children. So like a lot of the times there's none of that, the obligations required when it comes to like shuttling children around. You need a big car to get kids to school. It's such as the prevailing thought in society, right? So like those trips that you'd be making because you have to kind of rear a family don't really have to happen. And if you live in an urban area, then you're more likely to be able to walk to places where you can get your groceries, get food, et cetera, et cetera. It's proximity to amenities. There isn't any research on queer people in active transportation, but I tried to pull together what I could. There's a history of queer people like biking and walking, of course. There's a couple of cycling groups in a couple of cities actually that were specifically formed as alternative spaces for gay men and sometimes lesbians to sort of hang out. That wasn't a bar. And instead of cycling spaces, lesbian motorcycle groups also sort of exist. Not quite bikes, but different kind of bike. It's still really cool, and it also kind of goes about that space of like community building in places that aren't bars. Um, Hopefully something we see in the future is more research on that topic. I would love to see it. Um, Besides gays don't drive, there's also this sort of thing where people are like, gay people walk fast. Or you may have seen there's a YouTube video, it's like from a mini series. I don't remember who did it, but like there's a quote that lines like "Move, I'm gay." And I think both of those kind of feed into this idea that gay people like walk fast or move with a purpose in public spaces. And I think that there is a undertone there that we should look at when we get to the next section. Um, Trigger warnings on the violence and the homophobia and the transphobia, all that's going to come up in our next section where we look at like harassment in public spaces and how people actually experience public spaces. And so what I think we have is we have this really interesting dichotomy between like public transit agencies who are outwardly and openly, affirming the rights of queer people across the world, and I'll have more pictures of like other agencies having like pride buses and pride paraphernalia later. But I want to compare and contrast that to what I have on the left side of my screen, which are real headlines from real papers about attacks and violence that have happened to LGBT plus people on transit. And I want to set this scene up to like to have this conversation about like, even though queer people are sort of enamored with transit, even though this is fascination with riding the transit bus in queer communities, we still experience a lot of violence. And I think it's kind of sad. But yeah, I just want to like point out that like between like both of these two slides, these are mostly European agencies that have like come out and made pride buses, and then these are all American ones. Portland left, the top is King County Metro, I think. The bottom one is Muni in San Francisco. There's been a lot of talk from a lot of agencies that try to like, tell themselves as yes, like we are 100%, queer friendly. We're here for queer rights, et cetera, et cetera. But I feel like the experiences on public transit are oftentimes really perilous for queer people. There was a survey done by the Movement Advancement Project, or not participation focused in any sort of means. They were just trying to get a climate survey of how queer people sort of like see themselves in public spaces. And half of all the respondents they interviewed said they avoided going places because of how unsafe they were towards queer people. Public transit was cited as the number one most unsafe place to be as a queer person. It was 69%, worse than being on the street, worse than being in public buildings and public spaces, and worse than being at the park. I think that's really enlightening. Because I feel like if you don't, there's a lot of reasons why you may feel unsafe on public transit. I don't think that like people understood like how unsafe people can feel, riding the bus and riding the train. And out of that 70%, 10% of them said that they outright avoided riding transit entirely. And I thought that was pretty insane. On top of this stat, that's also saying that 1/3 of every trans person has been like denied service or faced harassment on public transit because of like who they were. There was a study done in Portland by a great group of researchers from Portland State University, where they went around and basically interviewed trans people living in Portland on their experiences riding TriMet. And almost all of them have said they experienced some form of harassment while riding TriMet. There was a select group of people who had experienced outwardly like sexual harassment or violence riding TriMet. So one girl said she was stabbed on the platform waiting for the train. And the commonality within a lot of these sort of interviews is that like nothing was really done about it, and in some of the worst cases, TriMet employees who were told about these incidences either were like, what do I do about this? I don't know what to do about this, or actually participated in making it a more dangerous space for trans riders. They would laugh at them. They would dismiss their issues and problems as unimportant. They would try and brush off the situation as like, I got a bus to drive. I can't be dealing with this right now. They didn't really feel like there wasn't an urgency on TriMet's part to try and communicate with these people that like, their issues and problems matter. And there's a lot of reasons why that could have happened. But I think that one of the things we should talk about in this is that the police oftentimes were a group that did not solve these issues, they made them worse. And I'll get to that in the next slide. But the takeaway from this I want to focus on is that like after these traumatic events, most of the participants noted that they no longer felt safe on public transit. But they had to keep taking it because there was no other viable option for them to complete the day-to-day task. And I think that, you know, having a pride bus is really cool, but when these things are happening on your transit system, then I think there's definitely a clear failure in how you treat these riders. And I feel like, you know, if I was a person who was harassed by TriMet and on TriMet and I saw a pride bus on TriMet, I would sort of feel a little offended that like they felt like they could sort of pander to me without really solving my issues. Walking while trans deserves its own slide because it faces a lot of issues that I think that need to be talked about on their own. Black trans women in particular are focused on because like oftentimes, especially in New York, when the police see them, they often feel like they are holding out for like prostitution. There was a very, very, very high profile case. I had the headline in the front of the slide where a woman was walking down the street in Harlem with a condom in her pocket. The police stopped her, found the condom, and then charged her for sex work. And this unfortunately happens across the nation. It isn't limited to New York. And is a major, major issue that trans women walking in public space can oftentimes face. And we're not even talking about the train. This could happen on public transit. But even just, you know, walking to and from stops, walking in their neighborhoods, transgender women are just at a higher risk of arrest and then facing violence in the carceral system in the United States. So I want to point this out because, you know, we can't rely on law enforcement as a means to solve our problems to violence in public spaces. We have to look to other means and other strategies to try and solve this. I have a couple of ideas. I wish I had time to talk about them, but I don't. I just want to say something you hold on to as you go through this presentation. And I think just to bring this all around, my whole point behind having this, I've done this talk 4 times. And odds are, if you're sitting in this panel, you've probably seen me do this again. I know I have some regulars here. Shout out to y'all. Thanks for coming. But like, I'm going to keep doing this talk because I feel like these issues just are not focused on. I've just got at a TRB in DC, very, very, very little queer presence and people, let alone queer issues there. And I feel like we can't continue to sort of have this forward-thinking lip service of like we're progressive and we stand for queer rights when like we're letting queer issues go unsolved in our public transit agencies. Queer people, it's really incredible that queer people have such an affinity for public transit, yet they still face these sort of things happening to them. And I think it makes it even more incredible is that like these affinities continue. You know, people still hold these opinions even when these problems aren't being solved. And I just want like people that are at transit agencies to realize like how special that is to have people that are supporting you and out here like trying to hold you up when like I feel like there's a group that's disproportionately at violence on these spaces, you know. I know very few Black people that are like, yeah, you know, I love riding the bus, just reach my day, you know, like people don't usually think like that when it comes to public transit. And I'm sure like a lot of us here do feel that way because we were fans. We have to consider like the greater riding public, like how do they feel when riding buses? How do they feel when riding trains? And I think that like the least we could do is try and give this group, you know, some of our research potential, some of our time, some of our, you know, thought leadership and trying to think of ways to make queer people feel safe on transit. And I want to touch on, which is probably the worst consequence from not feeling safe on public transit. It's not being able to use it to get to the things that you have to. And this last section, it's my longest section, kind of focuses on what happens when like you need to use transit to get to the things that matter to you in your life. This picture that you're looking at was the trip that I took from my university to my doctor in Atlanta, Georgia, because I wanted to start HRT. And I didn't have the money to afford a therapist. I had to go through informed consent, which basically says that like I know the risk of taking drugs. There isn't a informed consent doctor in Tennessee. There's one in Johnson City. So at the time I did this, I had to travel up to Nashville, down on the Greyhound bus into Atlanta, then take MARTA up to the office where it actually was. I was harassed several times. I got hit on a bus station overnight because I couldn't leave. It was a harrowing journey, but I remember it very fondly because I started HRT. But it's a little bit of an extreme sort of trip. But my point in this section is going to be like, these are things that people have to do to get like, you know, healthcare and to get mental health care and like access to resources that like affect them. And I think it's important to talk about those things. I love this video. I don't think I'm going to show it in the interest of time. It's basically Stephen Colbert from the old show, The Colbert Report, which you may remember, talking to a planner called Richard Florida. Richard Florida sort of penned a paper where he was like, you should be following your queer people around because queer people, railways are property values. Like if you want, to have a better house in the future, live near a gay person. And I don't blame Richard Florida for popularizing this idea, but I think that this clip is really endemic of the idea that queer neighborhoods and queer people are sort of tools you can use to sort of better your city. We don't, I think a lot of times when we think about gentrification, we don't think about how it impacts queer communities. But for the past 20 or so years, there's been this prevailing idea that if you're looking to live in a neighborhood that's hip and cool and places that can raise your sort of land value, you can move to a queer neighborhood. I'm working on getting this clip on YouTube. I tried to look for it and I couldn't. Within the day, I'm going to try and post it so you can see it. I'm going to post a link in the Slack channel for follow-up questions, I guess, or somewhere else. But please watch this video. I think it's really eye-opening and enlightening that people consider people like that. I can't see the chats. I promise to go back through all of them when I'm done. I think it's just a casualty of how the screens are being shared on Zoom. So I read a book called There Goes the Gayborhood. It was a lot of my theory come from this section of my presentation comes from that book. It's by Amin Ghazani. Please read it. It's amazing. But basically, she didn't use this word for it, but there's sort of a queer neighborhood life cycle that starts when looking at queer neighborhoods, right? So how a queer neighborhood forms is that the queer people with the least means co-locate in an affordable area of the city. Oftentimes it's the only area that they can live in. The Castro in San Francisco was one of the only neighborhoods that queer people could get leases on when it came to apartments. And that's why the Castro became a gay neighborhood. World War II soldiers got discharged for being gay. They ended up in San Francisco all together. They're all we're already here together. Where can we live together? The answer was the Castro. And as these queer soldiers sort of settled in the Castro, other people that are living in the area followed them. And so the area already existed. It was already a poor area. But because these people were getting out of the army and moving here, had some sort of capital sometimes, it gentrified that area from a place that was really, really poor to a place that was just very poor. It was still a ghetto of sorts, you didn't want to live in the Castro, but I do want to acknowledge that these neighborhoods already had people living there when people got there. And as people that had money sort of poured into these areas and, and opened up shops and opened up stores, it did contribute to this cycle of gentrification. The area becomes a queer center then, it becomes an area of queer life and, queer love, et cetera, et cetera. But as this happens, as the neighborhood sort of gets gentrified from a place that's bad to a place that's good, straight folks start to move in. And the straight money is what really, really begins to gentrify a neighborhood. Once that money hits these neighborhoods and once people hit these streets in these neighborhoods, not only do they gentrify them, they push out the queer businesses that were already there in the first place. And so what happens is as real estate prices go up, as tax values go up, these queer businesses that do not own the land that they're sitting on get displaced to other parts of the city where they can afford. And so the queer people with the least means oftentimes move first and the cycle begins all over again. This plays out in a lot of cities. I just did this presentation at Transfer Camp DC, and so I kind of wanted to make a map showing how this looked in that particular area. DC's first this map is off center, I'm sorry, but DC's first sort of queer neighborhood actually centered around 8th Street, a little bit north of the Mount Vernon Triangle, right? As that area people got displaced in that area and ended up moving to this DuPont Circle, which sort of remains, DC's long time queer neighborhood, right? And as rent goes up in that area and people get displaced, they move to a different area. In this instance, so it's U Street, it's Cardozo, it's Logan Circle, and to some extent, Adams working to Columbia Heights. And as these areas go up in rent even more, people continue to get displaced. So now you have people fleeing to all sorts of different parts of the area, trying to find somewhere where they can live. But what happens is as people get displaced, these sort of anchors of queer life oftentimes end up remaining where they are. So in this particular example, DC's LGBT center is it's right off of U Street, right? So a lot of people just can't afford to live in that area anymore. Yet, if you're looking to get to a place that has a support group, mental health care, free computers to use, sometimes they have job trainings and classes there, you have to kind of commute into this area. So regardless, if say you're really, really poor, end up having to live in Anacostia, right? And having to commute in or like even further out, Prince George County out in Northern Virginia. You now face a trip that requires you not just going from one end of DuPont Circle to the other, but now traveling across the metro to get to your doctor's office. And like I said earlier, right, if transit is something that's like not easy for you to use, then like, can you imagine having to ride 2 buses and a train to have to get to your doctor's office if it's that scary? I spoke to someone who works at the Mazzoni Center in Philadelphia, and they basically told me that like their Black trans people are their number one like set of clients. They all live in North Philadelphia, and they have to ride the train down in packs because they don't feel safe riding the train through their own neighborhoods. And I think that like queer neighborhoods sort of serve this purpose of like being queer enclaves for people, like even if you feel like the neighborhood is dead or we don't need neighborhoods anymore, the sort of like prevailing, that's clearly not the case, right? Like people still face harassment, people still face discrimination. These neighborhoods provide a sense of safety and a sense of community to people who need them. Like these neighborhoods are still important, even if you feel like you don't have to live in one. And every time that queer community shifts, like we lose a bit of that history and lose a bit of that culture. And Gonzani sort of said that you needed 3 things to sort of like hold a neighborhood down, right? Institutional anchors, like centers or health center or like healthcare areas, like like healthcare centers or clinics. A coordinated effort to sort of preserve these historic areas that are important, like these historic scenes and historic places like Stonewall or like in Boys Town, where they have, the pillars that have all the history on them. And you need property ownership, because like it's harder to move you out of a neighborhood if you own the land it sits on, right? Like it's harder to like displace you if you're owning and not renting. And like a lot of these areas just don't have that. If you go to Atlanta, Atlanta's like historical neighborhood is Midtown. And it's the corner, like I think Piedmont and 10th. If you go there now, there's a rainbow crosswalk, but all the businesses that were there that were queer catering, they're gone, because like they either had to like cater to straight people in order to stay alive, or they had to close because they just couldn't afford the land anymore. And like when that happens, you lose that safe space. You lose those sorts of areas where like those sorts of things are important. Piedmont Health and Wellness is still in Midtown. But that being said, queer people that live in Atlanta live upwards of 30 minutes away by car. And they're not even talking transit, like if you live in Avondale or East Point or Decatur or South DeKalb, we're looking at 45 minutes to an hour to come in, from that bus into that train ride. And like, I think that's something we have to acknowledge, is that like public transit is the space where you get harassed or you don't feel safe and you're forced onto it again. Like, what does that mean? Like, are there days you don't go downtown to get healthcare because you're too scared to ride? Are there days that you can't go to see your therapist because like getting on the train and bus is just too hard for you? We have to sort of ask these questions, right? We have to ask, like, if transit is this unsafe place and we're displacing people to places where they have to use transit to get to these like essential, businesses, what does it mean? To have to do all of this. And I'm just talking about being queer. This compounds if you're female presenting, there's compounds if you're Black, there's compounds if you're disabled. It just gets worse and worse. And like every conversation you've had about like, being Black in public still applies to you if you're queer. That's still something you have to sit with and process on top of your queerness. And this is just kind of where I want to like bring the conversation to, is that like we are not focusing on these people, yet they face problems that are unique to them. And I think because of these unique intersections, we need to focus more on not just on like making it safer for women and making it safer for Black people. We make it safer for Black folks. We need to focus on making it safer for everyone, including queer people. This is a quote that I pulled out from the book that I think was really like endemic of like what happens when like you sort of begin to lose a neighborhood. And I'll just read it. On the last Tuesday of every October, hundreds of straight people and gay people crowd the sidewalks on 17th Street in DC in order to cheer on approximately 50 drag queens racing on stiletto heels from P Street to R Street. As the drag queens paraded along the street, taking photos with their spectators and handing it up to the audience, a young gay white couple began lightly kissing each other on the lips. A 30-something white man with a young girl hoisted on his shoulders pats one of the gay men on the shoulder and asks him if the young man would refrain from kissing in front of his daughter. One of the gay men responded by asking, why he feared his daughter watching two men showing affection in their neighborhood. A white woman standing next to the man objects to that kissing was not appropriate on the street. The second gay man retorts that it was a gay festival, and if they had a problem with it, they should not be here. As the arguing escalated, another straight couple jumps into the argument, saying that the father meant no real harm and reminds the gay couple of how lucky they should be that this event has the support of straight people. The gay couple repeated that they belonged here and they should go elsewhere if they didn't like what they saw. Frustrated, the straight couple pushed their way through the crowd away from the gay couple. This happened in a gay neighborhood during a gay event. Can you imagine what's happening in the communities across America? And like, it's just the tip of the iceberg, y'all. And just one more example. This is in New York. New York's one of the places I picked to kind of pick like what it looks like if you are displaced from a queer community. Is just a Callan Lords Community Health Center. Callan Lords a big like clinic in the West Village. They cater a lot of HIV patients and a lot of trans patients. You can't afford to live in the West Village if you're any regular like queer person, right? And like you've seen diffusion to other places, Hell's Kitchen, Harlem, Williamsburg, Brooklyn Heights, Bushwick, etc., etc. And some of the richer queer people have sort of removed to sort of Hell's Kitchen. They either remain in the West Village or they moved to Hell's Kitchen, Brooklyn Heights, Park Slope, Williamsburg, and then in New Jersey, Maplewood, South Orange, or Montclair. If you're a little poorer, you're probably still in New York City. You may live in Jersey City. There's a lot of queer people living in Jersey City now. Or you live in like, Bushwick, some parts of Astoria, Harlem, right? And like some of these places are easier to get to than others. But like, and a lot of these places, even a trip to the clinic would be a several train ordeal or a bus and several train ordeal, and it's just another example of what this looks like in other cities across the US. And that's my presentation. I'm really sorry that I rushed. And I should ask that I pretended this for queer people, but for this question I guess it's fine. I'd love to hear everyone anyway. But for the next question, I'd like to limit the discussion to only really queer people to get their kind of opinions and perspectives. But this is fine for now. I did not say that starting out. There's no way you could have known. It makes me really happy to see that like none of these are anxious is a big one. Nervous is also a big one. It makes you really happy to see that like there aren't any other like really sort of negative words that come along with this. Bored and impatient, I get those, especially from less frequent services. But I guess what I was looking to see was like, were there any particularly positive or negative feelings that you had sort of waiting around public transit? I'm really, really happy that like the vast majority of it is just like, when is my bus going to get here? And when's my train going to get here? Others are happy there. Yay, it's really nice. All right, I want to move on, just in interest of time, if I can figure out how to move on. There we go. So the survey results here are from my time at Transpo Camp DC. I kind of want to build on kind of what I had then to see like if the results move a lot or change a lot. Same code, same room. But for people that are LGBT plus or their partners who ride with them and transit a lot, feel free to go ahead and like sort of answer the survey. I kind of want to see where y'all are at or where y'all are feeling when it comes to your experiences, on public transit and in neighborhoods. And I'll give it like another minute to kind of people to go through it and kind of answer these. If the numbers change a lot, then I know that like the opinions that I'm getting are different from what I had last time. If the numbers don't change that much, then what I'm also assuming is that we'll have even more of a more solid baseline for how people sort of feel in areas. And for anyone who cares, I was able to get the data from that last presentation separate. So if you want to see that Mentee stuff for any reason, I can share that too later. Okay, so like not a lot of movement. For anyone who wasn't familiar with these questions before, I kind of want to see what people's like feelings and stuff are on public transit. Some notes I do want to see. I do see that the means people that say they would avoid transit entirely is going down. That's also very good. Also see that the numbers about neighborhoods are also going down, which is not very good. But what makes me the happiest about this is that people generally feel safe where they live. They generally feel like they can access resources where they are, and that public transit isn't this really like nebulous place for a lot of the people that are here. That's really, really good. 3.4 is not great, but like it's also not like a 2 or a 1. And that's great. That's great stuff. I'm gonna go ahead and close this down. I could leave it up actually, If I want to just go ahead and jump right into the Q&A, I'm fine with that. So, does anyone have any questions or thoughts?
I have a quick question. I think you were planning to get to this in your presentation, but you may have run out of time. But I want to know how what you presented on um, relates to how little of a perspective there is for BIPOC queer folks in the professional space of being a planner, um, and how to change that in order to ensure that these perspectives that you speak about can be heard so that queer people can feel safe riding the transit that they love. And sorry, my name is William and I live in San Francisco.
Hi, William from San Francisco. Thank you for the question. I'm going to try and keep my answers to 30 seconds so we can get as many people in as possible. I know it's kind of hard. 30 seconds to a minute, I guess. But I think that a lot of the reason you haven't seen these sorts of questions being asked is just because, like, it's just like you said, like, there aren't a lot of BIPOC queer people working in like transit spaces. And I feel like because there isn't that sort of like knowledge base there, like people just don't ask about these things. One of the things that I noticed was really really bad at TRB, no offense to TRB, I think it's a great conference, is that like oftentimes we'll have experts or people who call themselves experts speak on behalf of queer people, on behalf of Black people especially, on behalf of disabled people especially, and like I feel like, you know, that's fine. I'm happy that you went out and did your research and think of yourself as an ally. But at the same time, there are things that like a disabled person is going to say that you were never going to ever like think about. You know, there's things that a queer person would say that you're never going to think about, and there's things that a Black person would say and experience that like just because you don't have that lived experience, you're never going to think about. And I feel like a lot of the reason why like this presentation is unfortunately very unique is that I when reading about like when like looking at neighborhoods and the way I interacted with it my entire life, I've had that experience of being like only in St. Louis that I live where kind of like the gay neighborhood was. St. Louis is a cheap city, you know. Everywhere else I've sort of lived, I've been like, oh, wow, like why is it so hard for me to get to the things that I need to get to, you know? And I just think that having that perspective of like, you know, just having that diversity of people in places where not only where they are there, but feel like they can talk to their superiors, speak up the things that are important to them. They're in work environments that like support them and help them is really, really important. I'm gonna like close the survey down now. I think we've all seen it.